What is the most undervalued Mercedes Classic? I'm going to ruin a lot of people's lives if this is your dream car. But today, I've been kicking around a couple of topics lately relating to the values of certain Mercedes that are underappreciated. And there are a number of models that are really underappreciated that are out there. A lot of them didn't come to the United States. And if I'm going to give you guys 30 seconds to start thinking about what the car I'm going to talk about is, but in the meantime, I'm going to talk about several other underappreciated Mercedes classics, and then I'll check back in and see if any of you figured it out. So, as you know, Mercedes sent some of their best models to countries other than the United States, whether it was the 500 SEL with four-wheel hydraulic suspension, or the 300 horsepower 560 SEC, or the second generation 500 SL R107 with 270 horsepower, 10.5 to 1 compression, switchable ignition, and all the goodies, or the 190e 2.5 16 valve. But there's one car that I think is really underappreciated. And I've been a follower and a fan of these cars and an owner of one of these cars for years. I don't ever plan on giving mine up, so don't ask. But I think the model that we need to talk about is the 107026, which was either sold as the 450 SLC 5.0 from 1978 and 79, or the 500 SLC in 1980 and 81. Now, why am I bringing up the 500 SLC slash 450 SLC 5.0, which we're going to refer to as the 107.026 in this video? Well, it's because a lot of people, when they say, what Mercedes Classic do I think is going to be particularly valuable in the future, I mention this car to them, and they just, either I find like a decent example and they nitpick it to death, or they just sort of are like, huh, but it's an SLC. They don't get it. And the reason I think this car is so underappreciated is because the history of the 5-liter SLC, plus what the car actually drives like what it actually can do, and how accessible the car is, leads me to think that it's a car with really amazing history that is really underappreciated. So let's talk about the history of this specific model briefly, because I only have like 10 minutes. I could do a long format video on this thing and I still wouldn't crack the iceberg. Mercedes had been toying around with hot rodding the SLC with an improved rear suspension with cast aluminum rear control arms for way before 1977. And if you want to know what the suspension looks like and you have access to a 500 SEL, SEC, or 560 SL, or 500 SL, just take a peek under the back. You'll see something very different than you'd find under a normal 380 or 450 SL. When Mercedes came out with this special anti-squat suspension, it pretty much made it onto all the European market SLCs and SLs. But the standard 450 SLC was the one that got a lot of these improvements firsthand. So, as many of you probably are aware, there was a Euro market 450 SLC, but a lot of people are not aware that those cars had increased compression, they had stronger cam profiles, and they had overall a hotter engine. Their engine, instead of making 190 or even 160 horsepower, was good for a whopping 228 horsepower. And Mercedes capitalized on this a little bit more by developing a 5-liter version of this engine with an aluminum block, even bigger and better improvements to the camshaft, and the unique tri-Y headers that made it onto the 500 SL later on. These engines were rated at 240 horsepower, although it's highly likely, because of not just the displacement increase, but the improvements to the exhaust and cam profiles, it's probable that they made more power than that, but we're never going to know. Now, personally, my personal involvement with one of these things is years ago, my mom was looking for a cheap car. We always bought these cheap Mercedes and did whatever small repairs they needed to be drivable. And for $2,500, we picked up a 450 SLC 5.0 that was painted this weird shade of silver purple and had a falling apart velour interior. So I spent some time tuning the engine. I found out somebody to replace the timing chain. And we proceeded to drive it quite a bit. I remember driving the car with my friend Bo up to Jacksonville, and that car would boogie. It really didn't start to boogie until about 80 or 90 miles an hour, but after that it kind of opened up and would pretty much do anything you asked it to. I never found the top end of that car. I was always scared. But it had stupid amounts of power. Felt way more powerful than even a 500 SL, which is saying a lot. Now, these cars were developed as a homologation special. So Mercedes didn't produce them because they wanted to. They produced them because they had to. They decided that they were going to try their hand at motorsport again. And so they took the SLC to a bunch of long distance rallies, including the Paris-Dakar Rally and the East African Safari Rally. And these aren't short stage rallies like Colin McRae would drive in a Mitsubishi Lancer Evo. These were miles and miles and thousands and days of no roads or bad roads, flat out, you're doing this the whole time, you're at risk for damaging something. So these cars were actually built tough instead of fast. They were fast, but toughness was imperative to this model. And one of the things that I have to emphasize is that even though the cars were big, slow, and heavy, they actually did perform well. They won rallies like the East African Safari Rally. They placed pretty high, like 3 and 4 positions. They weren't bottom of the table finishers. They were actually competitive, even though they weighed twice as much as the typical car. Think Audi V8 and the DTM kind of competition levels. Even though they weighed more than, I think the guy's name was Shakhtar Mehta, who was driving Datsuns at the time. And then eventually he switched over to Mercedes, and then he went back to Nissan, Datsun. These cars were pretty light, and at the time Mercedes was actually rallying cars like the 280E. But the 5-liter SLC did something extremely well that none of the other cars did. It did not fall apart. It was not, struggling to get to the finish line. Typically the cars were just as good when they arrived as when they left. And they had air conditioning, which was outstanding, that these guys were doing 100 miles an hour over horrible roads with an AC system that actually worked. Anyway, I think these cars are undervalued today. That's all I could say. They're undervalued. I think that I'm not going to say what they're worth, but you could buy one for $10,000 to $20,000 that needs a bunch of work. And, and I think in a few years it's going to pay off at some point, but the payout isn't really anything compared to the joy of ownership. So if you have one of these great SLCs, then maybe leave a comment below. And I made this video as a tribute to the late Scott Sanger, who was a big advocate for preserving these cars. Thank you, Scott, for inspiring me many years ago. Scott died suddenly of a heart attack, and he had like 4 of them, but Scott was a really great guy, and he knew that there was something special about these cars. So in the meantime, if you have a great Euro SL or SLC, you've got something special. Take care, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.